First of all, a personal thank you to each of you who's not been sitting here since the Anurag Kashyap session and who's actually braved. It's rather like walking across the Himalayas to walk here. I'd say it's even more difficult. A short walk in the steep Himalayas, I would say, is easier than the trek to Samvad. But thank you for being part of this festival, and thank you for being here with us today. I just wanted to explain the background of how I came to curate this anthology. I'm from Kumaon, from Nainital, and being a Pahari and a Kumaoni is very much a part of my identity. Many years ago, Sujeev, Shakya, who's sitting here next to me, and I were at a festival called the Doon Readings in Nainital. I had not met him before. He's from Nepal. Kumaon, where I'm from, was once a colony of Nepal, and sad to say, and glad to say we are not anymore. And we were talking about the identity across the Himalayas. And this is a very strong link between people across the Himalayas and across this whole area, which is really in the shadow of Tibet. There's a lot of cultural connectivity there, which we instantly recognize when we meet all these mountain people, and it's very difficult to put it into words or into theory, into a PhD thesis. I'm sure it's been done, but I just wanted a personal sort of a garland of essays and short stories and fiction that took us through this region and see what is common in it. So each of these friends here has contributed their bit to this session. And I request Amrita to take forward and see in which order we will all give our stories about this. Amrita, who had you decided would speak after me? Huh? Yes, but how do we go to unveil it now? You'll have to bring it here because we're all wired up.
I'll give you a hand. I'm not wired.
Actually, neither am I. I can help as well.
Yeah. Bring the chair here. Oh. Okay.
Maybe I'll keep it.
Yeah, like this. That was Mountain Thunder, followed by lightning of applause for Nawazuddin in the next session. Come on, friends, come here. We want everybody opening out a bit of it. Yes. Come on, Janice. Come on, Thida. No. Come on. So we have literally unveiled the book, if not disrobed the book.
Who gets to take this home?
Whoever speaks the shortest. Should be. So a big launch, clap, thunderous applause. Thank you all. Can somebody, Amrita, can we put, Naveenji, put it back there, kursi ke saath, so that people will know. Whose lovely Ghatotkaч notebook is that? Yes. It's the final participant in the session. Amrita, who speaks next? We are short, we don't have that much time.
So now each of the authors will read out an extract from their pieces in the anthology. First up, we have Sujeev Shakya. He is currently the Secretary General of the Himalayan Consensus Institute and the founder CEO of Bead Management. In his essay, he discusses the unique identity of a Himalayan citizen.
Thank you. And it's great that this book is finally out. And it's out on Namita's birthday. So it could be the best birthday gift we can have for Namita. So I think as I was flying in this time from Kathmandu to Delhi, I take a window seat and I look out and I see all the Himalayas. I see the Himalayas, I see the mountains, and I see where does my country end, where does India begin, where does China begin. So this has been a question, and that's why I wrote The Himalayan Citizen. So I'm going to read 2 paragraphs out of it. So it goes, there's the second paragraph of the book. Growing up with international boundaries just next to you in the days when passports and national identity documents were still a new phenomena in our part of the world made me think a lot on the issue of Himalayan identity. This cosmopolitan world was fun, and I could smoothly adjust to the various differences. When I meet fellow Himalayan citizens, I tend to see the same sense of adaptability and ease with which they traverse the world. We never grew up with a strong sense of nationalism, as our sense of the country we belong to was limited to the singing of the Indian national anthem during school functions or when a VIP visited our school. When the Nepali national anthem praising the Nepali king and country became a daily ritual on Radio Nepal, we did not mind that either. On March 10th, when people would come out on the streets decrying the Chinese occupation of Tibet, I used to feel a sense of affinity, as many of my friends, their parents, and their communities would be part of this national saga. Though I used to find it strange that the people who traded in Chinese goods, wore Chinese shoes, and carried tea in Chinese flasks came out so strongly against the Chinese. Let me read another passage. There is a lot of connection between the Himalayan nations that are now forgotten or just remain in the pages of some book written by a traveler or an anthropologist beyond the interest of the common folks. The members of the royal families of Bhutan, Ladakh, Mustang, Sikkim, and Tibet were closely related. With the integration of Ladakh into Jammu and Kashmir and Mustang into Nepal, the annexation of Tibet by China and Sikkim by India, the real relationship of the Himalayan states has never been re-established. It is difficult to understand in today's context that the silver coins of Tibet used to be minted in Kathmandu Valley. After Francis' young husband created a base in Kalimpong and a new route to enter Tibet through Sikkim, the Tibetan trade moved from eastern Nepal to Sikkim and Kalimpong. But the Nyawa community, which is one of the key inhabitants of the Kathmandu Valley and to which I belong, was the only one given to trade with Tibet. Sikkim continues to avoid tourists from Nepal while pitching for tourists to come all the way from Gujarat and Karnataka. The exodus of Nepalis from Bhutan complicated the relationship between the two Himalayan nations. While a Bangladeshi can enter Bhutan without a visa, a Nepali cannot. While Nepal grants visas to SAARC nations, including Bhutan, the same is not reciprocated. Bhutan potatoes enter the Nepal market through an Indian trader in Siliguri, similar to how Indian tea enters Pakistan via Dubai. The inner line permits of Sikkim or other northeast states have not worked in the interest of integrating the Himalayan economies. I'll stop here.
Next up, we have John Elliott. He's a former Financial Times journalist who has been in India for over 25 years. He is the author of Implosion, India's Tryst with Reality, and writes a current affairs blog called Riding the Elephant. His essay is based on an interview he did with the fourth king of Bhutan in 1987.
Thank you. Well, if you take off again from Kathmandu, instead of just stopping there on the flight, you fly on with the mountains on your left, and you land in Paro. And you land in Paro, in Bhutan, which is what I did in 1987 when I was the Financial Times correspondent in Delhi. No foreign correspondent had been there for many years, and I was told the way to get in there was, as the FT, which was obviously interested in development, was to catch the foreign minister when he went to SAARC, and SAARC had only just been invented. When he went to a SAARC summit, I think it might have been the first summit, and tell him that I came from the FT and I wanted to write about development, and he'd get me there, and it worked. And I went in and I interviewed the king, and that's what this story is about. A young monarch's dream for his country's national happiness. As I walked into the darkened room of the imposing Dzong in the Bhutanese capital of Thimphu, I couldn't immediately see the person I'd come to meet. After a few moments, I spotted him, standing quietly in the shadows of a tall window, dressed in the traditional purple, gold, and green with a yellow scarf. "Oh, there you are," I exclaimed, thinking later this was not how one should greet royalty. When I'd met the British Queen in Delhi, we'd been told to bow or curtsy, not to shake hands, and never repeat what she says. No one had briefed me on how to approach Bhutan's new King Jingmi Singri Wangchuk, but he didn't seem to mind when we sat down and he asked me about my visit. As we started talking, I quickly realized how concerned and anxious this shy and dignified 32-year-old king, was about ways to develop this remote and diplomatically sensitive Himalayan kingdom sandwiched between India and China. How to open it up, but not so fast that it would disrupt a sheltered and secluded people. How to maintain Bhutan's traditions and peaceful Buddhist culture. These were the main questions. It was 1987, and in an almost paternalistic way, he was agonizingly aware of the enormous challenges of his inheritance, and that his decisions could make or break his tiny nation and its people. He felt that Bhutan needed protection from possibly uncontrollable and avaricious outside influences, and he didn't mention China, at a time when great international economic change, and he was acutely aware that some other countries had got it wrong and had found their culture swamped, notably Nepal, though he did not mention the country by name. He was particularly concerned about his people's happiness. We are convinced, he said, we are convinced that we must aim for contentment and happiness. He said at the start of the interview, whether we take 5 or 10 years to raise the per capita income and increase prosperity is not going to guarantee that happiness. A lot of things go into it, including political stability and social harmony and the Bhutanese way of life as well as economic development. He was, of course, referring to gross national happiness, GNH, a concept now known internationally, but then, in 1987, just an idea in his mind. I learnt much later that this was the first time he'd talked at length with this about any reporter. And when I returned to Bhutan in 2011 for a Mountain Echoes Lit Fest organized by Namita, I realized that my subsequent report in the FT on the 2nd of May 1987 was regarded in the country as a significant piece of historical record. And that's my story.
Thank you.
Salil Tripathi is a writer based in London. He chairs PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee that works on behalf of persecuted writers worldwide. Mr. Tripathi's essay takes you down the most important events in Myanmar's history, from 1947 to the present day, interspersed with his own observations during his travels there.
Thank you. I'm going to read bits of a couple of paragraphs from different parts so that there's some consistency in the flow. I do write about literature and how Burma first and now Myanmar have been represented in it. And I tell the stories of a few people who have been important in its history. One of them, of course, is sitting here, Thida, and I do write about her as well, just so that you know where it comes from. She had been a prisoner of conscience for 5.5 years, just so that you know the context in which I'm mentioning her. And then she was able to go abroad, and this story takes up from there. Thida enjoyed her time abroad, but decided to return to Myanmar. I'd fought hard for my personal freedom, but it was not only for me, she said. I could have compromised and avoided prison. I kept asking myself after my release, what do I want? I wanted to be free, but I also wanted to free my society. So I have to stay here. I have to work for my people, not for other people. That's why I came back. My life is here. People want me to get more political, but I want to be a good citizen. There is a private Buddhism of women like Thida who live by its precepts and the Noble Eightfold Path. And there is a more public, demonstrative Buddhism in Myanmar, which has lately revealed an ugly streak. The vituperative speeches of monks like Virathu, once sold on audio tapes and compact discs in the streets of Yangon, are now available far more widely and disseminated quickly through the internet, often with dubious videos bearing hate-filled messages and doctored images. That anger contrasts with the sublime image of the line of young boys and girls as novice monks walking along the footpath at dawn in village after village in Myanmar. Indeed, some Buddhist monks have encouraged the unspeakable violence unleashed against the Rohingyas, a term that Myanmar nationalists, including Suu Kyi, don't even use. During my visits there, with a few notable exceptions, most local residents I knew avoided calling the Arakan Muslims Rohingyas. It was as if by not calling them, they were trying to obliterate their existence. In 2017, over 600,000 Rohingyas had been forcibly displaced from the Rakhine province. Many of the Burmese people I spoke to spoke about the violence and would only call the situation complex. Some former student leaders like Koko Ji, who had courageously defied the military in the past and spoken eloquently against the generals, when we had met in 2013, now supported the attacks in Rakhine. Myanmar's tragedy was compounded by the fact that Suu Kyi's own conduct as a leader fell significantly short in performing many of those duties. She remained largely silent about the violence against Rohingyas, blaming both sides, thus equating the handful of ragtag Rohingya insurgents with the well-armed Myanmar army. The Burmese have been stoic, even stubborn, taken blows and bullets as they have risen against tyranny. Thida spent nearly 6 years in jail, fell seriously ill, and when released, she continued to press for liberty. As her autobiography, Prisoner of Conscience, shows, she bore no bitterness towards her captors. She credited her strength to Vipassana meditation. What else can explain that perseverance? An individual's faith is often quiet and personal. It can be singular and nourishing. It can strengthen the individual who is reflective, calm, and meditative. The angry monk's faith is arrogant and majoritarian. It diminishes the country. Myanmar has both.
Ma Thida is a medical doctor, a writer, an editor, a human rights activist, and a former prisoner of conscience. Her essay explores how literature, particularly literary festivals, can become means of dissent.
Thank you, everybody. This piece is called A Fierce Fear. Some paragraphs I'm going to read. Oppression by a dictatorship, 5 decades in the case of Myanmar, not only affects people for the duration of the rule, but has a long-term impact on their way of thinking. These changes in mindsets are hard to reverse. Fear prohibits curiosity and learning, even after restrictions are relaxed. This repressed fear has already had a huge impact on people's awareness levels and interests. For instance, today, the only common area of interest and knowledge shared by writers, speakers, and their audience is the country's current situation. Topics that deal with the current scenario are loosely grouped and categorized as politics. Given the lack of exposure to literature, and because news are earlier disguised as fiction, many see literature as a form of media. Political issues are at the heart of all communication between writers and their audience. Even poets write poems based on current affair politics, such as land confiscation by military or government cronies, or student strikes for education law reform. Passivity in the general populace is one impact of repression. It has also brought out the most basic instincts of self-preservation. Such attitudes cause people to become selfish, in that they think of their own security before others and ignore the possible impact or consequences of their own actions on others. I believe this phenomenon to become fierce about one's own well-being is a reaction to living under an oppressive regime. Fierce individuals do not seek to exact revenge on those who cause them harm. Instead, they target weak individuals or minority populations, those who cannot retaliate. These acts of revenge are fueled by a continued fear of dictators and brutal governance. It is my observation that writers and media personnel cannot always escape this cycle of behavior, since brutality and state censorship were used to control them for decades. Fear not only makes people fierce in terms of their behavior, but also in how they express those thoughts. The surveillance systems made writers and even ordinary citizens distrust each other. These surveillance may not have been overtly carried out by the visible apparatus of the state, but it relied on informers. This caused a great deal of insecurity and distrust of anyone, but one's immediate family members. Though hatred towards the authoritarian rulers may be an overarching emotion that is widespread among the population, it remains hidden within families. because people are afraid to talk to non-family members about their miseries.
Prajwal Parajuly is a writer from Gangtok, Sikkim. He enjoys trekking in the Himalayas and wishes he could live there full time. His pieces in the book, he has 2 of them, reflect his love for the hills and also speak about the effects of urbanization in these areas. And we would very much like it if he could read something from both the essays.
I'll read one if that's okay. I've encountered 6 people in the audience from Darjeeling, so I'm going to read a little travel piece on Darjeeling that's in this book, okay? Louder? Aye. Oh. Aye. Good? Okay. Every trip to Darjeeling I've taken as an adult leaves me sadder than the last. Nature continues being bountiful. Man continues being destructive. The click-clacking of horses on the Chaurasta, Darjeeling's pedestrianized square, is enough to transport me to happier, carefree days. We often spent weekends here when I was a child. Gangtok, my hometown, was a long way from becoming as shiny and Swiss as it is now. Darjeeling was only a 4-hour drive away. A trip wouldn't be complete. A trip wouldn't be complete without horses to ride on the square, cakes to feast on at Glenaries, and schools to visit, where it was understood we had board for a year or 2 when we grew older. Of course, the town and all of North Bengal was in the midst of gargantuan problems. The Gorkhaland Revolution, that impassioned movement that everyone here hoped would result in the creation of the Nepali-speaking majority state of Gorkhaland, had reached its crescendo in 1986-87. The Nepali-speaking people of West Bengal, the majority of whom lived in the Darjeeling Hills, demanded statehood on linguistic and ethnic grounds. It was an often violent movement, and clashes between the agitators and the CPRF personnel were frequent. Curfews, months-long strikes, and killings were normal. Yet my family was undeterred. The minute we would hear of things returning to normalcy, we would pack our bags for a weekend away. We made frequent trips because Gangtok didn't have a decent bookstore in the late 80s. Darjeeling's Oxford bookstore, bang in the middle of Chaurasta, was where I purchased my first Puss in Boots book. We went because all of us cousins had unending hankerings. Oh, wow. Hi. Can you finally hear me? We went because all of us cousins had unending hankerings for the chocolate eclairs at Glenaries. We went because the Windermere Hotel, where we were told the last king of Sikkim courted the American Hope Cook, charmed us. We went because we loved to see tea leaves being crushed and curled at the many tea gardens. We went, above all, because we couldn't get enough of Darjeeling's toy train, songs about which had been our lullaby since the day we were born. It was to capture the magic of this era, to relive a bit of our childhood, that we took our most recent trip to Darjeeling. Well-meaning people had warned us that we'd be disappointed. We reasoned that if we loved Darjeeling at the peak of the agitation, it couldn't be so bad now. We were prepared for the worst. We were prepared to return sadder. Thank you.
Janice Pariat is the author of Boats on Land, Seahorse, and The Nine-Chambered Heart. Her short story, Embassy, beautifully captures the myriad hues of Shillong while talking about heartbreak and political conflict.
So, can you hear me? Right, okay. I'm going to read from a short story, which is called Embassy, and it's set in not a very lofty place. Embassy is a very shady little dive bar in the heart of Shillong, a small hill station town which is the capital of Meghalaya in the northeast. And my protagonist is broken-hearted, and he's looking for a drink. Bishesh, the chiseled face Nepali chap at the counter, nodded as they walked in. Everyone knew Bishesh only spoke to regulars. Most of the time, he behaved as though he owned this place. He didn't. Some Marwari man did, but he wasn't usually at the bar. Shillong was safe now for outsiders to own businesses, but not that safe. Merely 20 years ago, streets rang with the cries of "Bedakhar." Memories in cases like these were long and warily forgiving. It was best to keep behind the scenes like an elusive puppeteer. Hence, if embassy had changed hands even 100 times from one Dakhar to another, nobody inside knew. Most were in no state to care. The place looked the same as it had when it first opened in the mid-60s. 2 rectangular rooms that echoed like empty tombs, and on the ceiling, long-stemmed fans that blossomed like tragic flowers. Here, people drenched their grief in alcohol and stashed their dreams behind the familiar, flimsy darkness that smelled faintly dank and sour, the odor of defeat. They looked around over the crowd of heads, and for a moment, his intention wavered. He'd come for a drink, but there wasn't a single table free. What could he do? His musing was interrupted by a rumble of slurry voices calling him over. The drinkers were in an amiable mood tonight, and more than that, they could recognize a thirsting, despairing soul. "Hey bro," they beckoned, "come join us. Hey, Shanghang ne." And from a dark corner, a single word, "Teiskem." Someone who knew his name. From that distance, they couldn't make out the man's face. It might have been anyone. It was a face that wasn't uncommon, marked by the singular weariness that settled over everyone's features in a town landlocked by more than towering mountains. Somewhere, the light shifted, a shadow moved. They caught the highlight of his nose, the familiar eyes, and a name snapped into place like a cocked gun. "Mama Lang?" he asked to be sure. The man replied by lifting a glass, knocking back the remaining liquor, and waving Tay to an empty chair. "Thank you," said Tay, taking a seat. "You look the same," said Mama Lang, pouring out 2 generous measures of whiskey. Tay couldn't possibly say that about him. A decade ago, Mama Lang was good-looking in his mid-20s, but now he was an old man. "Do you still fly kites?" Mama Lang asked him, scrambling on the table for the matchbox. "I work," said Tay, "in the agriculture department, in a government office." Mama Lang tilted his head and howled like a wolf at the moon. Tay almost spilled his whiskey in alarm. Mama Lang stopped and said, Good. That's what we fought for, to give our Khasi youth employment and opportunity." Tay shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't want Mama Lang to bring up the KSU days, the days when Mama Lang and others fought and rallied and lived as outlaws. He'd heard it all before, over and over again. From friends and relatives, he'd come here to think about Josephine and her brown eyes and her full pink lips that he'd never kiss again.
Okay, next up we have Tulsi Badrinath.
Back to Burma. Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me? Well, I'll just read. So this is fiction set in Burma in the time of World War II. In time to come, Major Bhavandar would hate the 6th of every March that day in 1942, when misfortune in the shape of an Arisaka rifle knocked him unconscious, and the war, that was not his war, for a country that was not his own, in a land that was not India, stole from him his youth and innocence. As awareness spread through his slack body, the major realized that he was tied to a tree deep in the Burmese jungle, a mass of glistening creepers and giant trees screening out the sky, so he could not tell if it was still afternoon or evening. Something sharp was pricking his chest. Blue steel glinted. At the end of the long, lethal blade, a Japanese soldier, hate aslant in his seed-like eyes.
Thank you very much. Now I think we'll ask Manoj to read, or first Sanjoy. Who do you want to do first?
Okay, thank you. Well, I was going to speak about...
the thing is that we've run out of time. Some of the speakers have overdone. So what we do now is get, I think instead of a reading, a line
I'm not
from each
reading.
of you. Just a line about the essence of your essay. Just one line.
Okay.
We
Well,
don't have time for reading, but for a
when I started writing this essay, I thought about writing about my grandfather, whose first job in the early part of the 20th century was to maintain the footpath going to Tibet.
Really?
Living in Almora, all my ancestors, male ancestors, have done the pilgrimage to Kailash Mansarovar. I'm the only one who hasn't done it because the route, the Tibet, India, Tibet, Nepal, all those boundaries were frozen. And what I've written in my essay really is that what if all that goes away? What if the boundaries are settled? What if communications are restored? Do we have a new, because Tibet is the fulcrum of the entire Himalayan interaction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now to Sanjoy.
I'm
very
actually
meaningful general over.
I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs, and I would appreciate
we
if
don't
you,
have time to read 2 paragraphs.
Then I'll.
No, read
should
one
I pass?
Tell us about it. What you said
It's
about
because I will take as much time to read the
lovely.
paragraph as I would to say about it.
Please
And
do.
if you want to read more, there's a separate book, Strangers
Yes.
No More.
which we should have unveiled here today.
But
next time.
it'll be in time. The jungles seethe with unrest and rebellion each step of the way as diminutive men and women, some in battle fatigues and others in tattered clothing, some with modern weapons and others with crude arms, fight for ideals, funds, profitable drug routes, and lost causes. They confront the military might of the respective governments. This belt has seethed with unceasing conflict, violence, and anger, and grief. Modern times seem only to have exacerbated the situation. And I'll read the last line of the essay, which sums it up, because this is really what I believe in. Ethnic aspirations and questions of identity will remain, but peace can grow with the growth of political autonomy for ethnic groups, large and small, within a national framework, accompanied by access to markets, technology, and better connectivity. In the search for peace, the peoples of the Eastern Himalaya have spanned more than 1,000 years in a lifetime.
Thank you. And Sanjoy, your essay really sums up the history and the confusion and the continuity of that area. A very big clap from all of you, please, before we make way for the next session. Thank you for your indulgence for letting us continue.